Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? So good to see everybody. And Deb Abner, we want to thank our fearless librarian and also our fearless director of congregational education, who is succeeding Terry, who retired from the temple. Deb Abner, for hosting us tonight. So it's we're so grateful to you, Deb. And let me know, Deb, when everyone is in, and then we will begin.
Wes, everyone is trickling in, so I think we still have a large number to go, and I will let you know.
We'll just wait. It's just so good to see everybody's face.
So everyone, as you know, we had a little snafu with our Zoom link for some reason, which often happens in technology. I am hopeful that all of you found this link easily, so I can expect that everyone will be coming. Thumbs up if you found it easily. The new link? Yes, good, okay. All right, Wes, we're up to 25. The number is 27. We're getting there.
Okay. And I would love to invite everybody, if I could see your beautiful faces. Seeing your faces is nothing less than the face of God. So if I could see your faces, I would be so grateful. And it also makes a conversation on Zoom so much easier, as you all know.
But what, you see my face all the time.
Well, that's a beautiful gift.
Hi, Wes.
Hello. So folks are still coming on. Okay. So it's 8 o'clock, and I know some people are still coming on. But Deb, I'm going to ask if you could show the outline, which is the first page of the handout that I sent to you, because I want to first show people what we're going to do, and then we'll do it. So if you could show page 1 of the outline. Okay. And yeah, and if we can make it great. There we go. There we go. So what I'm going to do first is invite people's reactions. I'll take, a half a dozen just general reactions to this book, Menachem Begin, The Battle for Israel's Soul by Danny Gordis. What did you think of it? I'd love to hear from people who loved the book. I'd love to hear from people who did not love the book. I'd love to hear a wide range of honest reactions. And then we're going to double click on different aspects of Menachem Begin as Danny Gordis presents him. As I shared in the teaser, I find him just about the most single compelling Jew of our time. It's hard for me to imagine a person that I have more respect for, or a person who, to me, embodies the spirit of the Jewish people and love of Jewish people and Klal Yisrael more than Menachem Begin, which is not to say, obviously, that everything he did is perfect or beyond reproach, but Lord, what a figure. So we're going to take a look at Begin as a warrior, particularly in the season before the state was created. As you all know, he was, born in Poland, and his mother and his father and his sister and his brother all perished in the Shoah. And he survived, and you know that he was interned in a Russian labor camp under extremely harsh conditions. And then he made it to the Yishuv as a member of the Polish army. And then he opened a whole chapter of great resistance to the British mandate and to the British. And you know that he was terrorist number one. He lived in hiding during the time that the British ruled. And even once he became a prime minister, he was never really loved in England. So we're going to take a look at Begin as warrior. Then we're going to look at Begin once he, you know that he's in the opposition for 29 years. He loses 8 times. The 9th time, when he's 58, he's elected. And we're going to take a look at a whole strand of his leadership, which is compassion. And, the Torah says 36 times, according to the Talmud, be compassionate to the vulnerable because you are vulnerable. He brings in the Vietnamese boat people who are obviously not Jewish. He does it, though, from Jewish values. Ethiopian Jews, he does not see color. He famously does not see color. If you are in, I've been telling this to people about going to Israel now and going to Spark. If you go, Rashir and I have been to Israel 6 times this year to see our father. If you go to any cafe in any place in Israel, you will see much more diverse group of people by far than you would at Pete's or Starbucks in Newton Center. Go to Aroma in any coffee house in Israel, and you see Black people and brown people and people of every color, and they're Jews, and from a whole variety. And Menachem Begin brought so many of them in, and he, of course, was a champion of the Sephardi community that was not seen by David Ben-Gurion and Ashkenazi leader. We'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about his peacemaker with Sadat, for which, of course, he won the Nobel Prize. And in that context, talk about settlements, because he really was the father of the settler movement. I mean, labor began the settler movement, but Begin loved settlements and would not even talk about curbing settlements during the Camp David Accords. And so I want to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about his move to destroy the Iraqi nuclear reactor, which, as you know, if you read the book, I guess this is perhaps dubious, but Dick Cheney ended up writing a big mazel tov to one of the military leaders in charge years later, and said that Israel had done the world a big favor. It was, of course, not applauded universally at all at the time, even within Israel. We're going to talk a little bit about Begin's Vietnam, which was the war in Lebanon. Then we're going to talk about his resigning, and he's sick and old and human. And then I want to end by talking about the legacy of Begin to Israel today. What is his message today to the state of Israel? And as Danny Gordis makes the point repeatedly, Begin was the most Jewish prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, a deeply Jewish man, unlike many of the other prime ministers of the state of Israel. And we're going to talk about what is his legacy as a Jew. So with that, we can go back to the full screen. Thank you so much, Deb. I want to just take some views and use your reactions or let me know in the chat. What did you think of this book? So anyone who wants to share what they liked about the book, what they did not like about the book, just at a high level, would love to hear it. Any takers? Lou Schneider, good to see you. And what did you think of the book? If you can unmute, please, Lou.
I only wished you would also include in your outline the relationship between Begin and revisionist Zionism and Jabotinsky.
Of course.
I think
yes.
If you don't understand, I mean, I know you understand it, but if you don't understand the sequence from Jabotinsky and revisionist Zionism to ultimately Begin and Herut, you won't understand where our friend, the current prime minister and the Likud came from.
Okay, Lou, thank you. Yes, I mean, Begin saw his mentor as being Jabotinsky, and was a lifelong, they didn't always see eye to eye, of course, and in many ways the disciple eclipsed the mentor, and they did have some disagreements, but Begin had a lifelong love of Jabotinsky and made it his business to make sure that Jabotinsky was reburied in Israel as Jabotinsky wished. So that is certainly true. Danny Mandel, what did you think of the book?
So first of all, I think Danny Gordis, as you do, I think he's fantastic, and he's a great author. And I found myself wanting to come back and finish the book really quickly because it was very, very well written and very engaging. And as I've already told you, your timing is impeccable because, I mean, how can you not relate it to today? And even though I didn't learn a lot of facts about Begin, I learned a lot about Begin and his deep love for Yiddishkeit. I didn't realize that at the time, and it all kind of makes sense, and it kind of makes sense to kind of what's going on today. So to answer your question, I thought it was a fabulous book, fabulous.
Thank you, Danny. And I'm going to come back to you at the end of our hour, talk about what you think the resonance of the message of it is to us today. But Danny is such a good storyteller. I mean, Danny Mando is a good storyteller, and Danny Gordis is a good storyteller. The way that he told the story about, for example, Sadat was able to land only after 8 o'clock on Saturday night because he did not want there to be any desecration of Shabbat, and the notion that he would be, take out his kippah and he would recite words from the Psalms. Really powerful image of a person who's deeply Jewish and also the prime minister. We'll take a couple more comments and then we're going to double click on the King David incident. Chaya Bekefki.
I found the book extremely, extremely appealing, especially now. It brought Begin to life in a way that was much richer and comprehensive than the image that was developed or purported him to be. In Israel, I'm an Israeli, I grew up in Israel. And unless you were what they call burned Cherutnik, Begin was the symbol of negative things, kind of extreme in a fanatic way, inciting the Oriental Jews against the Ashkenazis, superficial criticism. I think Begin, at least from the book, and I never imagined it, really was a model of the fact that you can be deeply, deeply, deeply Jewish without necessarily be part of an organized religious institution and without necessarily be terribly observant. But to Jewish identity, somehow he found a balance between the national, religious, and ethnic that was very authentic. Another thing in the context of today especially, despite being for 40 years in the opposition, despite being despised by the majority of so-called enlightened Israelis,
there's nothing on the bottom.
the national unity and the cohesiveness was such a high value for him.
Reaction.
In view of what Netanyahu is doing the exact opposite.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk about that high at the end. Absolutely. Some of the implications. I did want to ask everyone who's not speaking to please mute so that we don't hear ambient noise. So if you're not speaking, please do mute so we don't hear ambient noise. I want to just, before we leave canvassing the different opinions on the book, I would love to ask if anyone did not like the book. I mean, so far, our first several speakers liked the book, and I'm in the market for any, I always love creative contradiction and some creative tension. So if anyone did not like the book, would certainly love to invite that voice as well. So I will take Jane's iPad over.
Jane Weingarten. I didn't like it, I loved it. I'm sorry. What was new for me was seeing more in depth the relationship with Ben Gurion, which nobody has mentioned. I learned so much from this book about the way they affected each other and what they caused each other to do, and how there was a lot of unresolved feelings. It wasn't all totally negative in their views as time went on, when they look back over their lives. I really thought it was just, I'm so grateful that you chose this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, well, so far, the only range we have are people who like the book and people who love the book. I should confess my bias. I just fell in love. I fell in love with Menachem Begin. I yearn for a leader like Menachem Begin and somebody that I could respect as much as Menachem Begin. So I am very much in the market for somebody who has a contrary view. If anyone here does not feel that way, or if I'm missing something, or if the people who like the book and are Menachem Begin's cheering section, if we're missing something, I would love to invite that view again. So if at some point you want to offer your words, please do. I think, Deb, what I want to do now, let's take a look on page 2 of the handout, Deb, if you would. I want to double click on a few of the really challenging episodes. Begin was seen in Israel and certainly by the non-Jewish world as a terrorist. No, if you can go up higher there, Deb. Oh, I'm sorry. Right, page 2. Right, page 2. Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry. So keep going. One more page. And one more page, my friend. Perfect. Okay. So this is King David, and all of us who've been to Israel know exactly where King David is, and so you know that as Danny Gordis tells it in the story, actually all the different arms of the different Jewish defense forces, Etzel and Lechi and Haganah, including Ben Gurion, approved of the plan, and then one by one they fell away. And even though Ben Gurion had approved it, he then opposed it and disowned it. And then, as Danny narrates, 92 people died. Just a little bit more text, Deb, if you could just raise it. Perfect. 92 people died as a result of the attack, and 28 were British, 42 were Arabs, 17 were Jews, including the Irgun militants carrying out the operation. The dead also included 2 Armenians, 1 Russian, and 1 Greek. The attack fueled the fires of British hatred for Zionists. And Begin's, so the world, much of the world thought of that as a terrorist attack. How is that any different from, suicide bombers and homicide bombers attacking Jews during the First Intifada or the Second Intifada? But Begin said that he was a freedom fighter, and his take on this is this whole thing was caused by, and then Danny quotes that it was caused by the British exploiters themselves, who did not heed the warning and did not evacuate the building on the orders of their military experts, who took it upon themselves to remove the explosive devices, even though the slightest touch of explosives would have caused them to detonate. So it's really, it's the British, and he says the tragedy that took place in the civil offices was not caused by Hebrew soldiers who fulfilled their role with strength and self-sacrifice. So you can come back, Deb, to the full screen. So I would love to invite some comments on King David. This is something that I've struggled with, and actually we taught a class about it in the fall. When a Palestinian does that, they're a murderer and they're a terrorist and they have blood on their hands, although they would say we're freedom fighters. And now Begin does it, and he says he's a freedom fighter. Much of the world says he's a terrorist with blood on his hands. I would love your views on this. How do you see the King David attack? Joni Katz.
Yes, I think it was a terrorist attack. It was a terrorist attack, but sometimes it's necessary. And war is messy. And unfortunately, I always thought it was a terrorist attack, and I have a lot more understanding of it right now, and that the full scope of it, and the warning's not working. You call and no one understands when you give a warning for people to leave and the message isn't delivered, or they don't believe it. Something's like those fail-safe things didn't work to try to save lives. It was this, and anyway, so war is messy, and this was a war because they were the colonists, just like with the American Revolution. They were colonists, and they had to do things that were not acceptable to the British. The British wouldn't have left.
Right. So Joni, I don't disagree with you. And as I say, I love Menachem Begin. I will just say I am left with the gnawing and basically irresolvable tension and contradiction that the same exact logic could be used by and has been used by Palestinian murderers and homicide bombers and terrorists who say, hey, it's a war and we're freedom fighters and we don't have the traditional military power. We don't have tanks. This is what we got. And so I just want to say, you know, I buy it for Begin in that context, but once you buy it for Begin in that context, you kind of inherit the wind.
I think you have to look at context. What the Russians are doing in Kherson and in Kiev,
Right.
That's terrorist. There's no unmitigating evidence to say anything else.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take Shirley Saunders. We'll love your voice.
Well, it was a terrorist attack. However, you have to see it retrospectively, how Begin behaved after he got the opportunity. Well, first after the Altalena episode, where Ben Gurion directed Rabin, they thought that Begin was in the water swimming, and they tried to shoot him. They tried to kill him in the water, and yet there could have been civil war after that. And Begin remembered 2,000 years ago, from the time of the Roman period, with the destruction of the Second Temple.
Yes.
And he said that our destruction was caused by ourselves, by war between different units within the Jewish community on the Temple Mount, and he was not going to go there. And also, when he became a leader, he was a leader. And so retrospectively, the Palestinians, when they got the opportunity to leave, they still were involved in terrorism.
Okay, thank you, Shirley. By the way, the Altalena, which you mentioned, Shirley, I'll just pick up on that. What Begin accounted it, as Danny Gordis recollects it in this book, one of his proudest accomplishments, which is that he avoided civil war. And Begin urged the people on the shore not to fight. And he said from the ship, we shall not fire, we shall not fight our brothers. And then, as you point out, Shirley, now I'm just reading from page 89, Begin was convinced that they meant to hit him personally and sink the ship. In fact, when the Haganah soldiers heard that Begin was on the ship, they apparently increased their fire. In other words, Ben Gurion and Ben Gurion's people tried to kill Menachem Begin. And when they knew that he was on, they really tried to kill him. And then nevertheless, Begin continued to shout over the loudspeaker, his fighters were not to return fire. So it is, I mean, he does seem very principled here. A whole separate class is about why Ben Gurion hated him so much and why Ben Gurion distrusted him so much and why Ben Gurion tried to kill him on the Altalena. But you're absolutely right. He did not, he did not countenance a civil war and spoke out against it. I want to do one last piece there because I found this. How many of you, when you've been to Israel, have ever been in Akko? That's that city up there, and Akko has this, prison, and a lot of Etzel fighters. I mean, this just feels so barbaric. Were hanged by the British, and I found that chapter a brutal chapter. these heroic soldiers trying to fight, and this is after Hitler and after the Holocaust, and we're trying to get a state, and our soldiers are being hanged by the British. And Begin, knows that he's terrorist number one, and so he's in hiding. Deb, if you could go to page 3 and page 4 of the handout, and I really am curious about your judgment about this. So the British were hanging Jewish soldiers, and if you could go to page 3, and I just want to read this. That's good. That's good. So Begin let them know that if you arrest Jewish fighters, we are going to arrest and kidnap British fighters, and if you hang Jews, we are going to hang British soldiers. So the British had these 2 Etzel fighters, and it wasn't clear what was going to be with them. And Begin arrested kidnapped 2 British soldiers, and when the Jews were hanged, then from his bunker in Tel Aviv, he made what he called the most difficult decision of my life. The next day, the bodies of the 2 British sergeants were found lifeless, hanging from a tree in Netanya. Begin had given the order. And then this is what Begin says, Danny quotes it: the hanging of the 2 British spies is not a retaliatory act for the murder of Hebrew prisoners of war, but it is an ordinary legal action of the court of the underground, which has sentenced and will sentence the criminals who belong to the criminal Nazi British Army of Occupation. And he regularly calls the British the Nazi British Army. And just one last page, Deb, if you can go to page 4. He quotes a British guy as saying, we could get over loss of life or property, but the empire cannot withstand blows to prestige, and the floggings and the aqua prison break and the hanging of the sergeants. These were blows to prestige. And then I found the last paragraph here so evocative. Begin defended the decision to hang the sergeants, but it haunted him until the end of his life. In a rare interview granted in July 1991, he acknowledged, "I admit it was a brutal act." And yet he could not fail to note that it accomplished one significant objective. After the brutal act, he noted there were no more hangings of Jews in Palestine. So we can come back, Deb, to the full screen. I'd love your thoughts on the hangings of these British soldiers. And there were others, but what do you think of that? Do you think it's morally defensible? To you, is that problematic in terms of how you see Begin? Was it legitimate? Again, fighting fire with fire. It does seem, if what Danny quotes Begin as saying is true, after this hanging, there were no more dead hanged Jews. How do you see it? Anyone want to take an attempt at sharing your thoughts on that one? Bob Worth.
Yes, so I thought it was a bit of a tit for tat in that I thought a lot of what Begin did was ineffective. A number of terror attacks weren't going to dislodge the British. When colonial powers leave a country, they're either defeated and Dien Bien Phu, like the French, or it's been a terribly bloody, in Algeria, there was a protracted bloody fight. Interestingly, in India, it was Mahatma Gandhi's, civil disobedience and passive resistance that was key. So I think they would do something to the British and kill them, which wasn't going to change matters significantly on the ground. And then he would retaliate. So to me, it was just a loss of life. And on this instance where the 2 British soldiers were hanged, I mean, it turns out they were actually had a fairly good attitude towards Jews. You know, in the book, it describes them as being kind of good people, like really the wrong people you want to be hanging. But,
Right.
So, you know, I didn't think it was I didn't see it as effective or very good.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally hear you, Bob. According to this, the British Colonel Nicol Gray, however, he seems to account the fact that all of this resistance that Begin did knock a blow to British prestige, and who knows if that accelerated England's getting out. The other thing that is, you know, so powerful, and this will actually connect with what happens when England, when Israel is founded, is from 45 until 48. Now the Holocaust is over, and now there's all these Jews who are without a home and they're stateless, and the British would not let Jews in. So getting the British out of Israel so that Jews could come into Israel was kind of the context here. The Brits were not letting Jews in, and Jews had nowhere to go. So after the Holocaust, Jewish life continued to be very much at risk. So I think that was what part of the context for the violence and the urgency of all this. Let's pivot to a happier subject, which is going to roll the film forward. And now, after 29 years in opposition, Menachem Begin is voted Prime Minister of Israel. By the way, you know, we don't have time to talk about every single issue, but some of the quotes that Gordis offers us about Ben Gurion seeing Sephardi Jews as dust, D-U-S-T, and not even civilized people, explains a lot of the Ashkenazi Sephardi tension, and explains why Begin was really seen as a champion, the anti-Ben Gurion. And once he's in power, let's go, Deb, if you would, to page 6 and page 7 of the handout. This is easy to love. The other stuff has not been particularly easy to love, but I just wanted to talk about page 6 of the handout. So here we go. That's perfect. Tellingly, Begin's first official act as prime minister, only a week after his inauguration, was to grant 66 Vietnamese asylum in Israel. He assured the group that they will enjoy all hospitality and promised them help finding jobs and learning Hebrew. Many of these Vietnamese stayed in Israel. Some have become restaurant owners, settling in Haifa and Tel Aviv, and their children have grown up speaking Hebrew. When Begin met with President Jimmy Carter in Washington in 1977, and you know from the book that they hated each other, Carter used the opportunity to publicly laud Begin for his rescue of the Vietnamese boat people. And in his response, Begin placed the episode in the larger context of Jewish experience and a distinctly Jewish universalism. He recalled the St. Louis, a ship with more than 900 Jews escaping Germany in 1939 that had been turned away by Cuba, the United States, and Canada, and which ultimately sent back to Europe, where many of the passengers perished in the Holocaust. We have never forgotten the lot of our people, persecuted, humiliated, ultimately physically destroyed, Begin responded to Carter. Therefore, it was natural that my first act as prime minister was to give those people a haven in the land of Israel. Deb, if we can come back to the full screen. And this notion of Begin as bringing in and seeing and taking mercy upon the most vulnerable, Ethiopian Jews, Soviet Jews, etc., was a big piece of his work. Would love to invite some comments on that, particularly because that feels so much easier to love. But anybody want to just talk about that aspect? Begin, and here you have a guy who hangs the British soldiers and who blows up to King David, and the same person feels moved by Jewish history and Jewish text to rescue the most vulnerable. I found that richness very human. Any takers on commenting on that? Lou Schneider. If you can unmute, Lou.
Since we keep coming back to King David, I wanted to share one thing that I read in several of the books that are written on the subject. There was this British guy that was the big boss of the soldiers around King David, either major or colonel, whatever it was. And he allegedly said when they got word from the Irgun that there was going to be an explosion in 15, 20 minutes, he allegedly said, "I don't take orders from the Jews."
Right. Okay.
Now, that may be, in other words, a lot going on there. I still believe that the basic goal of King David was to get rid of the files and stuff like that, not to kill British soldiers.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Thank you, thank you. So I wanted to put a Begin's kind of love of the vulnerable, or reaching out to protect the vulnerable, which is easy to love, with something that in today's world is much more fraught and much more complicated. Some support it, others have very complicated and challenging views on it. And that is Begin as deeply committed to every inch of the land of biblical Israel being in the state of Israel today. So, Deb, if you could please go to page 8 of the handout. You'll remember that the welcoming Sadat after Shabbos was the easy part, but then the actual negotiations were hell. And that's perfect. Thank you, Deb. That's perfect. Because Carter, as Danny Gordis presents it, really loved Sadat and did not get Begin at all. And one of the particular stumbling blocks was settlements. So, no less frustrating to Carter and Sadat was Begin's refusal to even discuss an end to the settlement project. But here too, they simply did not understand Begin or Israel. Their frustration was in large measure a result of their failure to appreciate that the settlements were far more than a matter of policy for Israelis. So the settlements would later become more of a right-left political issue in Israel. At the time, the mere subject still raised the question of whether or not Jews had a right to the land of Israel. Eretz Yisrael was Eretz Yisrael. Either the Jews had a right to their ancestral homeland or they did not. For Begin, the belief they did was axiomatic. Without that belief, what justification was there for the Zionist enterprise in the first place? And then there's this whole business about defensible borders. They quote Abba Ibn. I do not exaggerate when I say that it has for us something of a memory of Auschwitz. Carter and Sadat seem to have had no appreciation for any of these issues, not for the fact that the settlements had been launched not by Likud, but by labor governments, nor for the psychological implications of what they were asking of Begin and all of Israel. And then the American and Egyptian leaders failed to understand Begin's ideological instincts. His heart had always been with Gush Emunim, the religious nationalist movement that spearheaded settlement growth. They were, after all, his ideological heirs. So, Deb, if you can come back to the full screen. Begin, how do you see Begin in terms of really this unqualified support for settlements? And it's now 2023. And is history kind or unkind to this instinct of Menachem Begin? Anyone want to offer some thoughts? Okay, Shirley, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also love to hear from some new voices. If anyone would like to share their words, new voices would also love that. Shirley, please.
it depends who's looking at the subject. From the perspective of those who believe in compromise, it's not looked on kindly, but by the perspective of those who believe in the land of Israel, it was vital.
Right. So that's part of what makes Israel so endlessly complicated is precisely an issue like settlements, because on the one hand, it's been policy of America for years of a two-state solution. And on the other hand, you can't have a two-state solution when there's a lot of settlements. And on the third hand, it's also the case that the settlements are really not the impediment to peace, because the real sin of Israel, according to the Palestinian Street, is not 1967, it's 1948, it's Israel's very existence. So I don't have the answer. All I can tell you is Begin here, the question itself feels very nuanced to me. And it feels so nuanced that I got an extreme position on settlements feels off to me. And here, I don't know whether this is because of the time in which Begin lived or not. He feels unnuanced in a way that to me is not helpful. We'll just take one comment here from Chaya, and then we'll move on to the Iraqi nuclear reactor. Chaya.
I just want to mention that at the time, the West Bank was really part of Jordan. And when the settlements began, it was almost like it was on land that was retrieved from Jordan. The whole concept of Palestinians as partners to a dialogue came a little later, came a little after the Labor government essentially almost pushed for the settlements. So like where there were negotiations, and Al-Aqsa is under the auspices of the Jordanians, not the Palestinian Authority, the whole wrinkles began a little later. So when Begin thought of the settlements, not as settlements, but as coming home, in that context, it made a little more sense.
Okay.
Things change.
Yeah. Thank you, Chaya. Thank you. Speaking of things changing, one of the things that changed was the reaction to the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor. I remember where I was when I was watching the news that Israel had done it. And I remember, I was in college at the time being so proud of Israel. Look, Deb, if you can go to page 9 of the handout. It was such a courageous, military move and totally successful. And I want to double click here. Perfect. That's perfect. None of the pilots died. The attack was a glorious moment for Israel's military, and it fit Menachem Begin's worldview perfectly. The Jewish people would not survive without military power and a willingness to use it. And though planned in a spirit of self-reliant pragmatism, Begin saw in the success of the operation the hand of God. Speaking to the American Jewish leader Fisher, Begin said that while he was no mystic, he did believe in Elohei Yisrael, the God of Israel. How else to account for our success in accomplishing the virtually impossible? Every conceivable type of enemy weaponry was arrayed against our pilots when they flew in and out of Baghdad. They had to face anti-aircraft guns, ground-to-air missiles, fighter planes, all there to defend Osirak. Yet not one touched us. Only by the grace of God could we have succeeded in that mission. And then, Deb, if you can come back to the full screen for a second. What do you think of, first of all, what do you think of the fact that we did it? And then what do you think of ascribing that huge military victory to kind of providence, that God was there with our pilots? What do you think of that move? Any you know, does that theology work? Do you have any concerns about that theology? Elise Friedman, thank you. I'd love your thoughts.
Well, when it happened, that's exactly what I thought. I couldn't help it. That was exactly what I thought, that this was supposed to happen. It was the right thing to happen. And I still don't think I was wrong. That's it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, yeah, I'm with you. There's only one slight cautionary note, which is I'm always a little bit skeptical when people put God in the middle of human battles and say God is on my side, because of
Yeah.
course, you know, history is littered with people who said God is on my side and who do terrible things in God's name. Actually, the late Rabbi Sachs wrote a whole book on this topic called Not in My Name. And Rabbi Sachs talks about how many horrible things have been done by people who say they're doing it in God's name. But in this case, you know, I have to agree with Begin, but again, with the asterisk of how that very same line of thought is very often abused by people in terrible ways. I wanted to bring one last piece on this.
Well, I did have some second thoughts about saying it was God that had interfered, but it was exactly what they had accomplished was exactly, in my mind, exactly right.
Yeah.
So
you know what? I'll just give you a piece from Harold Kushner in a completely different context, which to me is helpful with this tension. Harold Kushner quotes Psalm 146, who says, God feeds the hungry and God takes care of the oppressed and God shelters the homeless. And Kushner says, does God really do that? And then Rabbi Kushner says, he invites the reader to read it, the verse backwards. That is, not that God is the subject, that God actually feeds the hungry and God actually shelters the homeless and God actually takes care of the oppressed. But if you read the verse backwards, that when the hungry are fed, you feel the presence of God. When the homeless are sheltered, you feel the presence of God. When vulnerable are taken care of, like the Vietnamese boat people, you feel the presence of God. So God is not the subject that is actually doing the action, but when that action is done, you feel the presence of God. And in that way, when we were able to do that, to destroy Saddam Hussein's reactor and have no casualties, not that God was the actor, but the fact that it happened makes us feel the presence of God. So in that Harold Kushner little inversion, that's a way that works for me. I did want to bring one last piece to this. Deb, if you'll look on page 11, the first couple paragraphs of page 11, just bring a little piece of wry irony to the whole subject, which is, here we go, that's perfect. Years later, when the United States went to war against Iraq during Operation Desert Storm, American officials would essentially recant, because President Reagan was ambivalent about the whole thing. In June 1991, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney presented to David Avery, who had been commander of the Israel Air Force at the time, a satellite photograph of the Osirak reactor remnants. On it, Cheney wrote, "For General David Avery, with thanks and appreciation for the outstanding job he did on the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, which made our job much easier in Desert Storm, Dick Cheney, U.S. Secretary of Defense." Thank you, Deb, if you can come back to the full screen. Just wondering, what light does that tortured history have on this question, or what does it cause you to think or rethink this whole issue of our taking out the Osirak reactor? Yeah, so I guess what came to my mind was was the Russian proverb, I guess, a broken clock can be right once a day. So I'll go with that. Where I want to save some time for our evaluation of Begin. There's the war in Lebanon, which was terrible, and then there is his deterioration and the fact that he resigns, and he's not well, and he resigns so that he doesn't really have to meet with Helmut Kohl as head of state to another head of state, because as you know from the reparations argument, he really felt, since his mother, father, sister, and brother had been murdered by the Nazis, that all Germans were culpable, and he did not want to have to meet Chancellor Kohl, and so he resigned, and he died a recluse, watching videos that his unmarried daughter Leah would pick out, and the two of them would watch videos together, and he didn't go out much. And then, of course, once he died, he became really a hero in Israel. And if you've ever been to the Begin Center, it's amazing. And if you haven't, you should go to the Begin Center. So he dies a recluse. And, as it says in the Torah, Acharei Mot Kedoshim, after death, people become, the holiness is all the more apparent. He's now lionized, as this great leader, and has a museum, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to end our hour with two questions. One is, what is the legacy of Menachem Begin to the state of Israel today? What does his leadership say to the state of Israel today? And then we're going to end by saying, what's the legacy of Menachem Begin to your own Judaism? Because as Danny Gordis makes the point repeatedly, Begin was just the most Jewish of Israel's prime ministers. So, Louise Wolf, please tell us your thoughts.
I was struck in reading this book, along with having at some point read Ruth Weiss's autobiography, at what a very deep influence in each case. They were very forceful actors on the stage of their societies and in the world, and yet they were tremendously inspired by the values of a parent in the course of action that they adopted. Begin's father set the example for him of not accepting anti-Semitism, and
Yes.
And so it gave me the impression of what a significant choice it is that parents make about what values they display in front of their children. And you don't know how it's going to work out, but this is a question for Jews everywhere. So
yeah, thank you. That's so true, Louise. His Begin's father was a fighter, and Begin's father was all about Jewish pride and love of the Jewish people, and Begin embodied those qualities. By the way, one thing I never knew was that he was born on Shabbos Nachamu, which is the Shabbat after Tisha B'Av, and the Haftarah is the great Joel Sussman song Nachamu Nachamu Ami, and he was named Menachem because he was born after Tisha B'Av. And Lord, did he ever embody his name. Danny Mando, what do you see as his legacy today?
So much. So he is the reason that Israel is what it is today. So many things written in that book. So he recognized his fans. He's this little Polish Jew, got voted in by the Sephardic Jews for the first time, and go to Israel. You said it earlier. You go to a cafe. He is the man that changed the entire tone of the state of Israel. And look what's happening today at another level. So his legacy, that's why I thought your timing with this book is just like, are you kidding? His pride in being a Jew and Israel. He didn't give a crap about the world. That was it. And you know, it's the same today, even more so. And I personally was touched. So just two anecdotes, one a little negative and one very positive. The negative is that my mother was one of those people that got the checks from Germany, and it really made a difference in her life. So, and I actually didn't know that he was against that. I understood it, but I didn't know that. On a positive, I spent a week on a army base, you know, Sorel, and it was all Iraqi Jews. They loved the guy. They talk about, I bet you're still talking about him. He was the king. He was their legend, and it permeates today. So his influence, I think, is permanent and was tone changed forever.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Molly.
My understanding about Begin, and I was in Israel at that time during the shuttle diplomacy between Begin and Sadat that was going on. And my understanding was, I mean, what I think about Begin, and I have to say I didn't read the book, so I have a lot to learn, but I do think he
Molly,
gave the
before you go,
Sinai
can I just
Desert
ask- can I
back
ask
to
everybody-
Israel.
Molly, can I just ask
I mean,
everybody?
back to Egypt. And to me, that shows that
Yeah, Molly, can you just pause for a second? Can I ask everybody who's not speaking to please mute? Because I'm hearing ambient feedback. Thank you. Okay, Molly, you're saying.
I think a big part of his legacy was that he gave the Sinai Desert back to Egypt, in my understanding, to have a friendly border with Egypt. So at the same time that the Gush Imunim were settling, you know, near the West Bank or wherever they were, my understanding at the time was that the West Bank was more strategic in terms of protecting Israel because it was up high. It was sort of the high ground. And, but he did give back the Sinai Desert, which to me implied that Israel was an imperialist. You know, they weren't looking to take over land. They just happened to have this land. And they were trying to use it strategically to protect their people.
Wes, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Wes. Can't hear you.
No, we can't hear.
Wes, we can't hear you.
Unmute, Wes, unmute.
He apparently clicked on mute.
Ed, if you're the host, you can unmute him. Send him an unmute message.
I actually did that.
But he's gone now.
Yeah, he's probably going to try and come back in. I wonder if he was having a bad connection.
Yeah.
Let's just wait a minute.
Took a coffee break.
If you were speaking, please continue your thought. I'm sure he would not mind if we continue the conversation.
He's back, but he's muted.
I am back. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Got the technical difficulties. So Molly, you were saying.
I was saying that I think that Begin showed that when I was in Israel at the time, you know, for when some of the shuttle diplomacy was going on. And it was my understanding, I mean, this is what I thought personally, that he was giving, when he had a willing partner to negotiate with, he negotiated, and he gave the Sinai back very quickly. So I said that I think that the reason that there may have been settlements and why he was holding on to the West Bank was because it was the high ground above
Right.
Jerusalem, above Israel.
Got
And so for strategic
Right.
reasons,
Got
to
him. I thank you.
protect-
Yes. So he did. Yes. So he did give the Sinai back, and it was. It did require some time with the Knesset, as Danny pointed out, although it also required evacuating Jews like from the town of Yamit in the Sinai. But it resulted in a peace with Egypt that has lasted ever since. I want to just close with a thought about Begin and what it means for Israel today. Begin had total integrity. I mean, he didn't do things that were easy. He often did things that were hard, but they were always principled. I mean, even the hardest things that he did. I mean, Altalena, he followed a principle. We're not going to have a civil war. A Hebrew fighter is not going to lift up a sword against the Hebrew fighter. The King David and even the hanging of the British spies, he had principle behind it. He had principle behind bringing in the Vietnamese boat people and the Ethiopian Jews and the Soviet Jews. He had a principle in making peace with Sadat and giving up Sinai, which was not biblical Israel. And he had a principle about biblical Israel. So he was a man of principle, not of convenience, and a person who lived in the light of his own integrity. And I think that is very inspiring. And I hope that all leaders of Israel and of America, for that matter, would live with that same kind of integrity. He made hard decisions and he took a lot of flack. I mean, he took so much flack for Osirak reactor. Shimon Peres and people within Israel gave him all kinds of grief, but he lived in the light of his own principles. And you know, as someone just mentioned on the chat, he didn't make money, he didn't monetize his leadership. He was truly principled, and that's all I can say is that would be good to see now. Finally, I wanted to leave you with some spiritual homework. Begin was the most Jewish of all prime ministers. What does he say about our own Judaism? And what I find inspiring, and I have a lot of work, is two things. One is he really did seem to love all Jews. As Gordis points out, as Danny Mandel points out, he was not Sephardi Jew. He's from Poland. But Sephardi Jews loved him, and Ethiopian Jews loved him, and South African Jews loved him. Soviet Jews loved him. Somehow he was able to bring the Jewish people together. And I think that is hard to do, especially today. And I find Begin really a role model of Klal Yisrael. Second thing is the way that his Jewish values inclined him towards Menschlichkeit and ethics, redeeming the oppressed, beginning with the Jewish people, but also including all people, and the way that he blended universalism and particularism, to me, was a role model. So I want to thank Deb Abner for hosting our class so beautifully. I want to thank all of you for reading the book, those who did, and for sharing this conversation. And may Menachem Begin's integrity be followed by other leaders, and may he inspire us to our own deepening of Klal Yisrael and the merging of universalism and particularism.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Shalom.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Deb.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Very
you for
interesting.
inspiring.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for inspiring to read the book and to get
Yes.
to know Menachem Begin.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Good
Deb.
evening.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
You.
Thank
Shabbat.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.